All right, today we're back and we're going to continue with the series of today's date in Chassidic and Chabad history, specifically focusing on the Igris, the letters written by the Rebbeim from this day. And today I'm going to focus 99% of our time on a particular letter written by the Previous Rebbe that technically has today's date on it, although as we'll see, the date may be something of a mistake in how it was, how it reached us, how it was printed the first time. So it may not actually be from Tamuz, it may actually be from Tamuz, but that shouldn't really make much of a difference for our purposes. The topic is interesting regardless. Tamuz is also a chashuv day 2 days ago. So either way, the topic I want to focus on here, based on this letter of the Previous Rebbe, is the topic of chassidishe mayses. And the title I'm probably going to go with this, when I post this, is going to be something like, are all chassidishe mayses bobbe mayses, are they made up, or something like that. And so the initial question that title will probably elicit is sort of this stereotype out there that chassidim of all types, of all stripes, are known for telling stories, and those stories should be assumed, many would say, should be assumed to be inaccurate or completely untrue. Often you hear this dafka from the what's called the Litvische Welt, or today you could say it's sometimes the so-called Litvische Welt. At any rate, the non-Chassidic or anti-Chassidic world. And so I want to address that up front. That's not the focus here, really, per se. The discussion really is, the discussion going forward will be about chassidishe mayses within the chassidische world and levels of accuracy and importance. But just to address that up front, to share my thoughts on that, I think it's pretty silly to believe that chassidim, or sometimes if they're ire, the anti-chassidim, anti-Chabad people's ire is directed specifically at Chabad. The notion that chassidim or Chabad have a unique issue with telling stories truthfully, or sort of perpetually and habitually and compulsively saying stuff that's made up, as opposed to those on the outside who completely don't have this problem. That's I think most people, if you examine this objectively, would find that to be completely ridiculous. There's no reason to think so. It's almost assuming some kind of rule in physics or metaphysics that compels this to be so. There's no reason to think so. There are people that are good at telling stories accurately, and there are those who make stuff up and that knows no distinction. That's sadna da'ara chadu, that's true everywhere. Sometimes you'll find in Litvische Welt, they'll be very proud of the mayses of a particular story. Oh, I have this story, it's ish mi pi ish, I heard it from him and he heard it from him, as if that gives it some kind of a primatur of truthfulness, of accuracy. Maybe it's nice to aspire to that standard and to hope and to try to confirm that the story is true and that you have a chain of transmission, but that does not guarantee that the story is true, and something could go wrong with that chain of transmission at any point along that chain. I'll mention the book, The Making of a Gadol, which was controversial in its own right, but putting that controversy aside, one of the flaws, I would say, of that work was how much it relied on Litvische storytelling, mayses, hearsay, and the author seemed to take every single story and every version of the story ever retold somewhere in a yeshiva setting as being true, as being accurate. And often he ends up with multiple girsas for the same story. And his mahalach was to try to be miyashiv all the girsais, b'derech pilpul, or whatever you want to call it, but to explain how they were all, how they could have all been true, how they all could have happened. There's no reason to think so. The trait, just as there's a trait of not being medayik, of making stuff up, of exaggerating, there's also a trait of being skeptical, of trying to be mevar the MS, which I guess we'll be touching on, we'll get to. And someone who has that trait, when they hear a story, they have to apply the same standards, the same toolkit to every story they hear, regardless of the source. And That's true. That should have been true in those cases as well. The same level of skepticism and bikaris should have been applied to those stories. Moreover, I would say that even in the Litvisher world, there were plenty of sipuri gadlus, sipuri mayses, even the types of stories. It's not as if the chassidim told stories of maysim and Litvisher only told over kashas and terutzim and toisvis. Plenty of stories that have a fantastical element to them in the Litvisher world as well. Am I saying there's no difference whatsoever? No, it seems like the chassidishe culture elevated telling sipur tzadikim. Some chassidishe kreisen were known for sitting around and just telling over sipurim, and maybe those sipurim, or a certain segment, a certain percentage of those, tended to acquire more and more fantastical elements. So you have a certain genre of chassidishe mayses that sounds very fantastical going into it, very long, very elaborate, very exciting. If it involves a king or a forest or stuff like that, I understand. But a big percentage of chassidishe mayses are just so-and-so said, b'shem so-and-so, that a certain tzaddik once said the following vart. You look in the stories of all the stories in the chassidishe world in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was an explosion in printing this type of material. Big percentage of that material was of the latter category, not just exciting or a mayse, but a small mayse. When this tzaddik traveled to this town, he met this tzaddik, and they said this and that. Doesn't mean that it's accurate. Lavdafka it's accurate, but it's not fantastical. And the Litvische Welt has the same types of stuff. And the Litvische Welt, it took a few more decades, a few more deitas. Today, Litvische Welt has hundreds of books as well. It's mamish the same thing. Whether it's fantastical stories that are clearly so, or even if it's biographical and trying to piece together biographical stories and information, the same pitfalls, the same issues are applicable and relevant everywhere, and it doesn't matter if so-and-so, b'shem so-and-so, b'shem so-and-so said it. That doesn't make it true. So I personally take some offense when this stereotype is trotted out, as if there's, like I said, something inherently unreliable about chassidic narrative, chassidic storytelling versus non-chassidic. I don't think there's any difference. Moreover, if we go even further back, we can find that in Ashkenaz generally, there was storytelling in Ashkenaz, or Sayin Ashkenaz up until the later Deiris. You can find in Ashkenazi Mekaydes, they used to tell also interesting stories, exciting stories, fantastical stories, plenty of those as well. And we have evidence that this goes back even further. I don't want to go off too much, but it's another topic I was looking into recently. There's a Ksav Yad of Ashkenazische Sipurim going back to the 1500s, if not earlier, the 1300s, the 1200s. There's interesting stuff out there. So people always told stories. And the question is, what percentage of the time? How many stories? Did they write them down? Did they print them? Many questions or many tags we could apply to in each case to determine how they're similar and how they're different. But storytelling has always been around. Obviously, in the chassidishe world, they have their own history of storytelling. Not getting into that, but even talking within the Ashkenazi world, even within the Eastern European world, I think there's a lot more in common than there is that's so fundamentally different. So we'll start with that as a shtickle macha against this sprach, this signoin. And often, like I said, those that trotted out the most, you could tell have a certain hatred, a sinna, and it's almost like in my opinion, it's almost seeking to dehumanize and otherize the other, that the other one is a lie. We see it, of course, all the time in politics and other contentious areas like that, where people develop this othering and they hate the other, and they consider the other person fundamentally a liar, fundamentally or unreliable. Whereas if you zoom out, one could be more wrong than the other, more correct, more incorrect, but the human traits tend to be not that different from each other across the board. Like I said, Sadan Arachadu. So someone who's going around and saying these people fundamentally lie, it's tzarech bedika. Could be a certain community, could be dafka, a certain kehillah, a certain chassidus, a certain group of people, a certain subsection within a certain group are very makbid and very medayek on accuracy. So that's something someone with a chosh habikoros, a critical sense, can pick up and determine. And people that, like I said, talking about the people that go through life seeking to be skeptical and to apply a judicial amount of or a judicious approach to what they listen to, what they accept, what they believe. So this is an important skill, an important ability to be able to determine who is more reliable and less reliable. So of course that's important in life. But those who just generalize and say, oh, this group fundamentally are liars, and this other group, my group, is fundamentally not like that. It's often just wishful thinking and projection, and all that. So those are my initial thoughts on that question. But more directly, I want to talk, like I said, within the chassidishe world, within the world of chassidishe mayses, there are levels, there are dargas to accuracy, to reliability. And this is particularly an issue in Chabad. And I want to talk about my perspective as well. So we're back to giving langa hakdamas. I got some feedback from people. People said, actually, the hakdamas, the long, lengthy hakdamas are great. They're even better than the hamshach. I don't know if I should be insulted, take it personally or not. But I guess there are different types of hakdamas and hamshechim. Sometimes I feel bad from giving disclaimers that I think are less interesting than the topic. But sometimes the arum is just as interesting, if not more interesting. So in this case, I tend to agree. So let me share a little bit of where I'm coming from on this topic of accuracy and reliability, coming specifically, particularly within the Chabad world. So myself, growing up, depending on which aspect, which era, which part of growing up, but I guess I can start saying even by starting from late 90s. But certainly through the thousands, 2000s, Tafshin Samachs, there was always this issue of accuracy, of reliability, was always pretty high up on my radar. In particular in Chabad, one figure in particular is responsible for forcing many people to confront this question, and that fellow, somewhat infamous, notorious, is Rabbi Yeshua Monsheim. Speaking of haters, people who hate Chabad, those people tend to actually hate Rabbi Yeshua Monsheim very much, even though Idavka stood within Chabad for the value of accuracy. But that's because he wrote or published sharp stuff about the Vilna Gaon and the earliest Nagdos. So that actually had the result of generating all this hatred, although I don't think it justifies some of the behavior, some of the writing, the tone that we've seen out there, but that's a different topic. But within Chabad, Bishra Monsheim was, so just quickly by way of short biographical details, he was a librarian in maybe the National Library of Israel, one of the chashuva libraries in Eretz Yisrael. He had a job as a librarian. Similar in a sense to Rebbe Levin, who is the Chabad librarian, the librarian of the Chabad library, the Rebbe's library. But unlike Rebbe Levin, he wasn't a librarian. Bishra Monsheim wasn't a librarian in a Chabad mayses. He was a librarian in just a mainstream library. But he spent a lot of time researching and writing and publishing, and he was a big choker in Chabad. Often the term that will be used to describe him is choker, which may or may not be intended positively, but it's not deniable that would be one of the most appropriate terms for him would be that he was a choker. As it happens, the Rebbe had, I would argue, a very unique connection, relationship with these chokrim within Chabad. It's certainly my opinion, my contention, that the Rebbe believed that dafka the chokrim should be entrusted with handling Chabad history, with publishing new matters of Chabad history, or even be involved in publishing chassidus, the ksavim of the Rebbeim. The Rebbe, in my opinion, had, I don't think it's fair to say the Rebbe's interest or the Rebbe's involvement in being choker things was to the same degree, but the Rebbe approached publishing and history with a certain chosh habikairis, and I could say perhaps a certain modern chosh habikairis, and it seems like the Rebbe appreciated that you need to have scholars with a certain persona and a certain personality type and certain qualities. They're necessary in order to publish things properly and correctly. In my mind, I don't know if the term comes up a lot, but I could almost say these are the Rebbe's chokrim to a certain extent. Now, chokrim by definition tend to be more skeptical, and within the chassidic world, being skeptical is often seen as a negative, especially as we'll see, as we'll discuss, being skeptical about chassidishe mayses, chassidishe mekayres. But it seems like in the context of the way that Rebbe saw things, that Rebbe saw fit, how the Rebbe saw fit to do things, it seems like the Rebbe saw value in these types of people and their approach. And both of them had a pretty strong ongoing connection with the Rebbe, correspondence with the Rebbe, meeting with the Rebbe, talking with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe also had a connection with Reb Chaim Lieberman, who's from a previous door, the Frierdiker Rebbe's librarian, which is a whole other story, a bit of a tragic story. But the Rebbe had a pretty strong connection with him as well, and would spend many hours talking to him in Yonei Mechker, research, library, bibliography. So the Rebbe had his chavra of this type. And so that's just, I think, an important point to make up front, that, they're not stam. Sometimes they're painted as just being an oisvarf at the edge of the kahal, the edge of the machna, but the Rebbe clearly centered them and gave them a certain chshivas. But that's bekitzer. So anyway, back to Bishul Munshine in general. So he wore different hats. He was a librarian. He sometimes published stuff for Kahas through the official Chabad mode of publishing. He also had Chabad, not official, but Chabad publications. Like he had a Kovetz Karam Chabad in the late Mems, early Nuns, where he published Chabad stuff. He wrote Pardes Chabad, different Kovetzim were Chabad related. He wrote many Chabad Kovetzim. So that's a darga below that. Then he also wrote in other journals, not Chabad at all, not even Chabad related, topics that were not Chabad related. A few years ago, unfortunately, he passed away relatively young, maybe in his 60s, but by today's standards, still fairly young. Considered Beterem Ace, surely had much more work and research in him. So it was a loss for everyone. So there's an estate, there's an archive that the family runs, and with others' involvement, and they've published different chiburim from his collection, from his writings. One of them is Sefer V'Sipur, a big collection, anthology of correspondence that he had with many different people, different walks of life in Inyane history, Mechker, and other ksafim of his there as well. So at any rate, this is I guess by way of introduction, by way of background for who he was. But one thing in particular, or two things in particular that were notable when I was growing up, was that for many years in the I guess the late Nuns or early Samachs for sure, he had a column in Kfar Chabad where he published all kinds of new material from Ksav Yad and stuff like that. But sometimes he would also discuss, debate various matters. So one debate that I was already old enough and interested enough to follow was in the year, I think, Tafshin Samach Gimel. I was fairly young. I was around Bar Mitzvah age, but I was already interested. I would read the magazines, Beis Mashiach, Kfar Chabad, the Kfar Chabad I would see in Shul. And there was a big debate over the new Siddur printed by Kahas in Eretz Yisrael, where they redid the Tilas Hashem, they made Shinuyim, and someone in Beis Mashiach had written against it. And so Bishul Munshine was responding to Kfar Chabad, and one of the things he was known for, he could be very sharp, very sharp. So he was responding very sharply. So that was something, he was definitely on my radar by then. I think I may also remember from around the same time, he was also sparring with Shmuel Kraus, who was also a chayker more associated with Beis Mashiach, and I think they had a back and forth at the time about Shmuel Kraus wanted to work on a project relating to the Beis Rebbe, and I remember there was a big fight over, is it Babroisk or Bobroisk? It's a funny argument. So I think that was also perhaps around that time. There is also a website, Krumim, by the family, that contains all of Bishul Munshine's published writings, so it is possible to go double check and see what he wrote and find it there. So that was already at that point he was on my radar, and So he was a character. It was clear that he was an interesting guy, a bit different than the people that I would just come across in my everyday life. But so I was interested. I was intrigued to whatever extent. But then a year or two or three later, he had a column on a Chabad website that's no longer up, but it was up for many years. Sturm, I believe it was Sturm. Was it .org, .net, whatever it was. The website was called Sturm, an Israeli website. It was a bit more intellectual. Originally, they had Rabbi Shulman Schein's collection of writings hosted on their website, in addition to this column. Anyway, so he had a column called Sipurim Megilguleim that was very controversial. And the idea was that once a week he took a story that's printed in Chabad Makairis, usually from the last 100 years, more like contemporary authors' books, and he'd select a story and he would slug it up, he would debunk it. And explain why he thinks it's made up, it's not true. And there was clearly a very larger polemical element to it, where it seemed like he was on the warpath against the whole industry, if you want to call it that, an industry of storytelling and printing stories. And he was out to prove that they're lying to you, they're telling you lies. So this was very controversial at the time. And but for me, 15, 16 years old, this to me was very exciting. And at this point, I had some semi-regular access. If I wanted to visit Sturm once a week and see what he wrote, I could. So this to me was very exciting, and certainly had an impact, was influential on me at the time for the Tav Lamutav, but that was what I was drawn to and interested in. These were questions that I was interested in. At the time, to some extent, I guess I don't want to get too autobiographical here, but I had a certain skeptical streak in general, always trying to, if things are sheker, I want to know if they're sheker. Could be in the Welt in general. I remember a few years later, when I had a bit more access to browse, I would look up the debunking of other larger claims of pseudoscientific claims and parapsychological phenomenon and stuff like that. So I was always interested in those who were trying to kaviyachol establish the truth and disprove the sheker. So this was interesting to me. I don't know how many other people that age were following it so avidly at the time, but this was my, you could say, guilty pleasure, whatever you want to call it. And it was controversial. He was stepping on toes. There was someone else at the time who's still with us who was more associated with printing chassidishe mayses, and he was getting upset that Rabbi Shulman Schein was criticizing the stories that he printed, and he counterattacked. It was freilich. I'm not going to get into the entire story. It's as we'll see later, there's a question when speaking of stories whether it's devarim b'telem, whether there's any point to recounting everything. But whatever I'm sharing has a certain tayalis, I think, in terms of setting the background to the following discussion. So this was what he was doing, and people were upset about it. So if it's a story that you printed, so you could take it personally, he's calling you a liar, or a story that you told, and he's calling you a liar. But there was also the larger question of chassidishe values. Is this in line with chassidishe values that once a week, instead of telling a story and being mashpia, chassidishe toichim, once a week he's coming and slugging a story up? What are the tziri atzoin? What are the young chokrim going to take away from this? You want to young chokrim yeshiva, usually the staff, the mashpiyim, they want to be mashpia chassidishe values, emunah, whatever the values they want to teach them are. And this seems to be undermining that, doing the opposite, and introducing skepticism, cynicism. What are they going to take away from that? And he definitely had a very strong skeptical and almost cynical, or often cynical, tone to him throughout this whole series, which is why it was interesting to know that he was known to be someone who learned by Reb Shlomo Chaim back in the day, where Reb Shlomo Chaim taught them skafia and to daven ba'avoda. Apparently, Shulman Schein would daven on Shabbos ba'avoda for hours. And from Sefer V'Sipur, we also see that he wrote many letters to his children when they went to yeshiva, and he had a very strong, very idealistic notion of what chassidus is and what avodas Hashem is, and he was a shtickle kanoi for that notion, that concept of Avodas Hashem, Chassidus and Chabad, as he understood it. So it seems like what he was doing in the series, in part, was it was his way of making a macha against what he perceived to be the incorrect path, incorrect derech. So it wasn't just all about being negative. It was negativity directed towards what he thought is not instilling chassidishe values to him. This was not chassidishe values. This is stam, something else. Another thing, whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to describe it, but there's chassidishe values, then there's just anti-Jewish, anti-chassidish kfira, but what they're doing is not emunah. What he's doing is not kfira. He's trying to undermine the sheker as he saw it. That's how it would seem based on his larger profile as a person. But within that context, though, he was writing very sharp, very almost bitterly sometimes. So that was the side of him that was coming across mostly then. Also around that age, I had access. My father had bought the Kerem Chabad 4, the 2 volumes that came out around Tafshinun Beis that have the stuff about the Vilna Gaon and the Snagdos and a lot of interesting material in there. So my father had bought that around when it was published. So we had that in the house. I definitely had looked at that maybe around the same time as well. I was definitely familiar with that of his. So I was certainly familiar with other aspects of his work, although not all of it. There's parts of his work that I only came across later. But I'm just trying to fill out the picture here, so it shouldn't just be black and white, one-dimensional. So anyway, there was this controversy. Now, I actually remember that at some point, maybe he did a separate article on the larger question, where maybe he was asked or he volunteered to share his hashkafa. I would have to go find the article again, which it is possible to do, but I haven't gone and checked for it now. So I think he had written an article separate from that series, but as a companion piece where he laid out his beliefs, his manifesto as to where stories fit in, and truth and sheker. And I don't remember specifically how he put it there, but clearly he was communicating his position that what he perceived to be sheker has no place and has no value, and to cloak it in notions of chassidishkeit and emunah is incorrect. I remember big memra that came up in those debates was that the Welt says that whoever believes every story of the Baal Shem Tov is a fool, but whoever disbelieves them is a kaifer, or something like that. Interestingly, he once wrote about it more than once, and he was, I believe he was kaifer in that memra, and he wanted to prove that within Chabad Makaitis, that memra would be considered unacceptable. I think he was taking the position there that in Chabad, Hotman gehalten, you have to believe all the Baal Shem Tov stories. So you're not to say that whoever believes all the Baal Shem Tov stories is a fool. That itself is problematic. So he was taking the kainoistic stance to the other extreme there. So attacking those who say that from the right instead of from the left, if you want to call it that. At any rate, it was those were exciting times, fun times, and these are important questions. And these questions, you could say, are still with us, and certainly have still lingered with me. To a certain extent, I still identify as having that skeptical streak, and I want to know if a story is true. Within Chabad, within the circles that I'm familiar with, it's usually restricted to a relatively small number of people who are actively being boich in every story that comes their way about whether it's true, whether it's not true. Most people, I'm not saying everyone believes, there could be people that are stam cynical and stam don't believe also. But this particular streak of, in particular, if you talk, there are things that are sacred and are holy and are important, and you cherish those, and you want to distinguish between what you cherish, what you respect, versus stuff that's masquerading and pretending to be of that nature, of that quality, but not really being worthy of that. So that's where this type of skepticism could fit in. There are some other people of that nature. So sometimes there are forums or chats where this tone will be perceptible, will be noticeable, where you forward a story and people aren't just saying, wow, it's an amazing story. They're a bit more skeptical. Is this story true? Can we prove it? So often that ends up coming down to questions of historicity. So if someone says, oh, so-and-so came to the Rebbe, and obviously we're talking about chassidishe mayses. The chassidishe mayses from 200 years ago, from 100 years ago, and this mayses from the last 50 years. They aren't necessarily of the same nature. But today you'll have a lot of Rebbe stories, for example, and they'll say, so-and-so came, and it's a historic figure, and it relates to a date. So some people will say, hey, let's check whether the dates line up. Let's figure it out. That's usually tends to be a certain type of person who would also be called a chokrim, whether or not they officially or professionally serving as one, but that trait is identified as being a chokrim. Till today, it's somewhat controversial. If you're in a different chat and you raise a question about whether a story is true, where other people had accepted it implicitly as being true, so then people could be annoyed. Why are you asking questions? Why are you questioning? So this is still an ongoing issue in many ways. And then there's, as I want to get to, there's also the question of, like I said, the stories from 200 years ago versus a story from the last 25 years. Do they have the same value? Do I have to pay attention to any stories from the last 25 years or even the last 50 years if they don't have a clear source? Something that Rebbe said, something that Rebbe wrote has, of course, tremendous value. But if someone comes along now and says, a mayses that happened 50 years ago, do I need to listen to it? Do I need to pay attention to it? Do I need to be looking for value there? Can I tune them all out and never listen to another story people tell again? These are questions that I find interesting. So this is, I'm sure there are probably some other points that I may have wanted to mention. This is not a structured introduction, but these are more or less the thoughts that come to mind when this topic comes up. So in that debate, I remember that a particular passage was invoked. I don't know if he invoked it or people in the comments. Back then, there was also an active comment section. People would push back against him in the comments to his articles, and he would respond in the comments. I remember that originally the website had a space, a square, a field for writing the title of your comment, the actual comment, and the name of the person posting the comment. And I remember that on a website update at some point, they removed the option to write a name for comments going forward, but not just going forward, but lemafreya. So the names and all the comments vanished. So it was annoying to go back to those comments where you used to be able to see clearly. Not everyone wrote a name. People could have just written, stam. They picked a name for, just like internet comments and how they often work. People just pick a name for the sake of that discussion. If it's a platform where you have to put in a name. But he would put his name in on many of his comments, so that all of that disappeared. And really that's valuable. It's a supplementary material of the website that has his writings, reproduces his writings, but doesn't reproduce the comments, so it's missing part of the ensuing discussion. And those comments may be lost unless you find them on the Internet Archive somewhere. So sometimes there were lively discussions in the comments. Of course, he may have also written comments without using his name. I'm not saying that's impossible. So I remember that at some point in that discussion, that debate, there was a quote from the Previous Rebbe that was invoked, where the Previous Rebbe said, b'shem, perhaps Rebbe Rashab, that Rebbe Rashab said, I like the stories of the chassidim tell, even if they're not accurate, even if they are exaggerated. So that's a quote that's, I believe it stuck with me from that context, from that debate. So it was invoked. I don't remember who invoked it. I don't remember clearly if there were responses. As we'll see, this is the letter I want to get to. In fact, this is the letter that I'm here to discuss today. And we'll see that there's more going on in the letter. There's more context there beyond that one line. So it's possible that at the time people said, hey, look at the letter, there's more context. I don't remember if that happened or not. But this is what I remember in particular from then. At this point, we're talking about 20 years ago at this point. Which I still like to think and hope. Speaking of accuracy and skepticism, I like to think that if I remember something, even if it's from 20 years ago, but I tend to think, hope that it's accurate and meduyak and not without exaggeration or not completely a figment of my imagination. But obviously there's no guarantee, certainly, that it's 100% correct. So with all that, so these are questions about how we approach chassidishe stories from whether it's 200 years ago, 100 years ago. Stories from 100 years ago often come down to the authority of someone perhaps alive now or who was alive 20, 30 years ago and said a story about the Rebbe Rashab versus stories about the Alter Rebbe that usually, if they're not from the Rebbeim, so Talmidim in Lubavitch, they heard them from Rebbe Greinim, who was the Mashpia in Lubavitch. So there's that question. You could discuss whether the stories Reb Greinim tells are reliable, or you could take them one story at a time and evaluate them. But and Munshine did that in other parts of his writing. He has a sefer, he has a book, Hamasa HaAcharon, the last trip, the last travel of the Alter Rebbe, how the Alter Rebbe fled Napoleon and passed away on the road, and he put out a nice book, B'Seif Yamav, on that topic. And within that book, he was quoting, part of the concept was, he did research, he found every single chassidishe mayse that was told that relates to that tkufa. And in the comments, he would rank the sources and say, okay, this makar, even within the Talmidim of Tamuz who heard from Greinim, he said, okay, Falakan is the most accurate, and then Perlov is less, and another one is even less. Or he would discuss individual stories and be done about those stories. Can the story be true? Can we prove that parts of the story are not true, or the entire story is not true? So he did that with older stories. But with that particular series, he was targeting, I think, later Makairis, later sources from the last 100 years, which, again, either the person printing them could be upset, or the person who the story is attributed to could have children, Einiklach, who are makbid on the covet of their father, the Zayda, and he's being disrespectful. He's saying the person's not reliable. So that's the background here. Now, like I said, today, being Hey Tamuz, and this letter, at least as was printed, having the date of Hey Tamuz, this is a letter that discusses this issue and has that quote that I remember is indeed from this letter, but really the entire letter is on this topic, and it's rather interesting. So this letter is in the letters of the Previous Rebbe, Igros Kodesh Chelik Gimel, letter number 783, and it's from Hey, or whatever day in Tamuz of Tafresh Tzadik Hey, so that's 1935. And it's one of the longer letters from page 400 to 410. And this is actually a letter from the Previous Rebbe to the Rebbe, so there are different genres of letters from the Previous Rebbe, and one category is letters to the Rebbe during that skuf in particular, where often the Previous Rebbe would write in Yonim Ba'arichos, and that relates to the relationship, the dynamic between the Previous Rebbe and the Rebbe B'chlal, although sometimes it could be the Previous Rebbe used the opportunity of writing to family members, could be his daughters as well, as an opportunity to engage in certain types of writing. Previous Rebbe obviously being someone who engaged in many types and genres of writing, which is its own interesting topic. So there's this letter to the Rebbe, and it's the premise of the letter essentially is this question about exaggerating chassidishe mayses and the question of accuracy. And in the Igros there, they write that they included it in the Igros series from a copy preserved by the Previous Rebbe's secretariat, but it has corrections on it in the Previous Rebbe's handwriting. So it's not directly from the Previous Rebbe's handwriting, it's a typed copy presumably, but it has additional hagoyes from the Previous Rebbe. And interestingly, on top, the Previous Rebbe wrote, Chomer bilti me'ubud, unprocessed, unedited, unfinished material. So it seems like the Previous Rebbe was, in his, within the Previous Rebbe's perception, was being oisik in it and trying something out, but it didn't necessarily reach its final form in the Previous Rebbe's eyes. But since it seems like it was sent to the Rebbe, so it was included in the Igros. So let's jump into it finally. So it begins, Beis Hey, Gimel, meaning Yom Gimel, Tuesday, Hey Tamuz, Tafresh Tzadik Hey, Advatsk, Lechasni, Harav, Ramash Shichya. Now, the problem is, I didn't go look it up, but I'm going to trust them on this. Presumably, Tuesday was not Hey Tamuz in Tafresh Tzadik Hey. So they write, either it should say Yom Gimel Ches Tamuz, maybe the Hey is really Ches, so it's Tuesday Ches Tamuz, or it's the Gimel and the Hey are inverted. Really, it's Yom Hey, Gimel Tamuz was Thursday, Gimel Tamuz. Now, this is a letter written to the Rebbe, and in recent years, they printed an entire volume, Chelik Tezvav, where these unpublished letters, correspondence between the Previous Rebbe and the Rebbe Tzachai Mushka. So I looked it up, and in fact, in Chelik Tezvav, letter number 5,556, there is an entry for this letter there as well, page 209. And there they print the letter, but there's a whole additional hakdama, more personal stuff that I guess in the past they didn't consider worthy of printing. There you see that it's an actual proper letter with an introduction and responding to whatever the Rebbe had been up to recently, the travels, of a more personal, private nature. And then, at some point, after a few paragraphs, then it continues with what was printed in Chelik Gimel that we're reading, and then they don't reproduce the whole thing again. They just write dot, see the rest earlier in Chelik Gimel. And there they write, the way they printed it there is Yom Hey Gimel Tamuz. That apparently is what they confirmed is the real date. So it's really technically not Yom Hey Gimel Tamuz. It's not Yom Gimel Hey Tamuz, which is today's date. It's really Yom Hey Gimel Tamuz, but Gimel Tamuz was 2 days ago, and interesting that this is something that the Frierdiker Rebbe Taka wrote to the Rebbe on Gimel Tamuz, so that itself could be interesting. As can we say it's a topic that's negaya to Gimel Tamuz? Okay, we'll leave that to others to discuss. So the Frierdiker Rebbe writes to the Rebbe that Hatamim, which was this publication that the Frierdiker Rebbe had started in Poland and printed articles, essays, stuff from the Frierdiker Rebbe, stories, stuff from the Gniza, the famous Chersona Gniza. So this is Marachas of Hatamim, which the Rebbe was part of, Rebbe Zalman Garari, and maybe others were part of. The Marachas of Hatamim sent me a story, a submission of one of the Talmidim, and it was sent to the Frierdiker Rebbe for review, Lebikairis. The Frierdiker Rebbe says the story is Meshubash B'Yoser. It's completely corrupted, it's ridiculous. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, I never heard this story, even on the fourth tier, the fourth level of stories. So this already is right straight off the bat. This is the topic at hand. This is the premise of the letter. And right away, the Frierdiker Rebbe says there are 4 levels, 4 tiers of stories. Number 1, something you saw yourself, or something you heard yourself from your Rebbe. That's number 1. Number 2, the next level is you hear from someone else, and that person you consider to be an ish neman, a trustworthy person, something that happened directly to them. Even today, often when people tell a story, they'll say, it happened to me, so if you're hearing it from me, so they're hoping, they're aspiring to reach category number 2. Number 3, if you hear it, mipi echad miziknei anash habali tzura, mashahem kiblu pi iskena. If you hear it from chashiva, seriously chashiva, chassid, double lashon, ziknei anash bali tzura, they heard it from Skenim, so that's a makubal dika mayses by chassidim. And then the 4th level, the 4th tier, is stories that there's no attribution. And those are the stories where they take off, they add, everyone according to their personality, their mahalach, the way their mind works, etc. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, how even though I did hear from my father, the Rebbe Rashab, that even stories of the 4th tier are a chashuv thing, also a great zach, however, so the paragraph ends off on a positive note, that I heard from the Rebbe Rashab that even the 4th category, where people are clearly just taking it in different directions and adding and whatever they do to the story, even that he heard from the Rebbe Rashab, but these stories are davar gadol, or a big thing. They should be part of the Fabrenga, and we'll get to that. So that ties into the quote that I remember as well from later. But remember, the way the Frierdiker Rebbe got to this, the context here was that the story that was submitted is so corrupt, and I never heard the story even on the 4th tier of stories. So Frierdiker Rebbe is essentially making a distinction here, and that's the real message of this letter. Technically, is that there's something beneath the 4th tier. But here's where the Frierdiker Rebbe goes off into tremendous arichos, tremendous background, and maybe that's what the Frierdiker Rebbe meant when he said chomer bilti me'ubad, because it's going off to paint a larger picture about a certain background and context, and he describes there was a seder of when chassidim visit their Rebbes, and particularly in Lubavitch, and particularly in the Tkufa of the Rebbe Rashab, and there was a seder in Lubavitch of making kiddush after davening, the kiddushim and the chashuva kiddushim, where many people would gather, or maybe even the rebbeim would participate. And so when the Rebbe Rashab Taka b'doire, when he would participate in certain kiddushim, and also about the Frierdiker Rebbe's love for stories, which was a big part of the Frierdiker Rebbe's biography and autobiographical writings, is the role stories plays for him. and writing stories, recording them. Ultimately, it gets to a description of Shavuos Tafresh Nun Beis, so we're only focusing here on the parts of the letter that are negaya directly to the topic. So that Shavuos, the Friedrich Rebbe says, there were 7 minyanim of orchim, 70 guests. Sounds like it was for that tkufa. It was big. He mentions the lashon there that it was after Churban Lubavitch and this is Binyan Lubavitch, that whole era after the Marash passed away until things settled into place. So it sounds like that was a big number for that time, 70 archim, and a big number of them were taka chashiv chassidim. So during the Kiddush, the Rebbe Rashab, which the Rebbe Rashab participated in, the Rebbe Rashab shared 2 things b'shem Deb Marash. I'm not going to get into the first one. The first one is about saying biurim, taichin, and tanya, which is its own interesting topic, and based on the context there, it does seem to have something in common with the following thing, but we're not going to focus on that. And the second thing that the Rebbe Rashab said was that my father, the Rebbe Marash, said, Oyhev ani sipurei chassidim v'sichosam. I like the stories of the chassidim and their conversations. Gam elu advarim hamusiparim she'enam meduyakim kol kach. Even the things that are told, that are recounted, that are not so accurate. V'afilu elu advarim she'hem meguzomim. And even those that are exaggerated. The chassidishe sipurim machen varem unlichtig in the chassidishe heiser. The chassidishe stories bring warmth and light to the chassidishe homes. So I think that is the line, that's the paragraph that I remember from all those years ago. That was what was quoted. You see, the Friedrich Rebbe says from the Rashab and the Marash that I like the stories, whatever chassidim say is good, even if it's not accurate, even if it's exaggerated. Smacht varem unlichtig in the chassidische heiser. But as I've been saying, we have to see the full context there. Anyway, but let's continue. The paragraph itself continues. The chassidische sichas chulin. Chassidische sitting and stam talking is the chulin al taras hakodesh. It may be chulin, but it's chulin al taras hakodesh, which is its own expression. That it's chulin that's being treated like it's kodesh. Chassidische devarim betelim was in the sipuri mayses v'zayim ba'agzama, and the chassidische devarim betelim, like almost a nonsense, that in the sipuri mayses that are exaggerated is das eine von die Sachen was die Gemara rechnet in chulin. It goes into the category of what the Gemara says in chulin. Kol mad aser on rachmana shar alon kavasei. Whatever the Torah asers, it also permits. Gemara gives examples of chazer and stuff like that. So the devarim betelim devarim betelim in general, it's implying is aser. But chassidische devarim betelim in the exaggerated sipuri mayses, that's an example of kol mad aser on rachmana shar alon kavasei. What's aser also has a permitted version of it. That's the permitted version of it. So before we continue, I have a lot of comments in the Aris just on this passage and what my thoughts are, revisiting and reading the passage or reading the full passage. First of all, just the Friedrich Rebbe is using the word miguzamim, behagzama. This is a key word here that I'm going to focus on here, I'll focus on later. Interestingly, I should point out that just linguistically, the word hagzama itself seems to have evolved with time. If you look in Rishonim, to be megazem always seems to have the connotation actually of threatening. So today in Ivrit we say iyum, le'ayem, me'ayem, which l'chayr is meloshin ema. It's but ema in biblical Hebrew, or even in Hebrew up until seemingly the last 150 years, Ivrit, you didn't have this maf'il, to put ema on someone. There was no such form of the word, and it seems like that form was invented. I didn't go check, but I'm assuming it was invented and coined by the Mechadshe Hasafa Ha'ivrit. So in Rishonim, or even through Achreinim, the term for threatening was to be megazem. However, in Chazal, we do find the form guzma. Guzma in Chazal seems to be used to refer to anything that's a high number. The Gemara talks about high numbers in the Torah or high numbers in Chazal, that it could be a guzma. So that's where it seems to be more in the sense of an exaggeration. But the verb megazem or hagzama, that seemed to mean to threaten. And I actually went and looked it up briefly in Ben Yehuda's dictionary. And if you look under gozam, he defines it as meaning to threaten, and he brings many examples. And then all the way at the end, he says that bedibur ubesafra sachadasha, however, in speech and in the new literature, it means to exaggerate. So he seems to be attesting that it's in writing, it's a late development, although could have started earlier B'dibur, not necessarily Ivrit related. Just interesting linguistic comment aside. So, to get to this paragraph, which, like I said, I remember the first half, and we have to both see the rest of the paragraph and the rest of the general context here. But I want to comment a little bit on the second half here, which I didn't remember really from before. Because it really seems like there's two different but overlapping issues here. There's the question of, is the story accurate? Is the story true? Is the story correct? But he's also invoking terms like sichas chulin and terms like devarim betelim, which seems like it's a different issue, a different category. So we need to work out what these two things are and how they're different and how they're connected. Also, when we talk about accuracy, throughout this entire discussion, I started off talking about chokrim and being a choker, and the Previous Rebbe talking about accuracy. When you talk about the importance of accuracy, what is the importance of accuracy, right? So often a choker, in today's terminology, a choker often comes from some kind of academic background. I don't mean academic background strictly as in having gone to an academic setting, but an academic frame of mind, approaching the world through that type of lens, which doesn't seem to have so much basis and precedent in the Jewish world. The idea of someone sitting and evaluating stories for how true they are was not an official. Obviously, you can find in Sfarim Amol, first of all, most of the time stories are repeated uncritically. That's Bechlal. And even if someone here and there says that a story is a sheker, but it's not something that they did consistently. Interestingly, in the last 100 years, happens to be that in Satmar there's also a certain streak of doubting chassidishe mayses, being about chassidishe mayses, but it comes from a certain ideological place, because often chassidishe mayses were seiser some of the precepts in Satmar. So the way it seems to have been dealt with was by saying, chassidishe mayses are unreliable. So, but within Satmar itself, I don't think anyone has seen, when they themselves tell stories about their history of the last 100 years, there's no sense that there are higher standards of accuracy than anywhere else. So this goes back to the point I made all the way at the beginning about how it's easy to criticize others, but are you really applying that standard to yourself? Or is there an ideological reason why you're motivated to dafka find the flaws and dismiss? There may be some flaws, but to overstate them, to overemphasize them, dafka for the stories you don't like. So that's another notable example of introducing some consistent degree of critique, of criticism, a critical eye to stories. But otherwise, it's a little hard to find precedent for within the Jewish, from a Hamish chassidishe world, of consistently being critical and examining stories critically. So that's part of where the skepticism towards the skeptics comes from. Like where's this value even coming from? However, I should point out that, as we see here from the Previous Rebbe, and I wanted to mention later from the Rebbe was often very skeptical and critical of stories, in particular if he didn't have a good mocker. And as we'll see here, you can't really go through life, even a Yiddish life, a chassidishe life, with no chush habikairis, because at this point, maybe the number of stories that are told is higher than ever before, or the percentage of time we spend with stories, or the messages the stories can teach us, can imply, are too powerful. There needs to be some bikairis. But again, the question is, where's that haguf, or where's that bikairis coming from? What's the exact motivation? Obviously, I guess maybe we need to go to a therapist to find out, or whatever, someone to be magdir the different types of motivations. So, even if we're talking about accuracy, the question is, what is the value of accuracy? Is it coming from the more academic value of history and making sure that the history is true and truthful and not inaccurate, or is it more out the hashpa, the kedusha? It could be coming from that issue, from that value, like I just said, where the stories are conveying teichen and they have a hashpa on a person. So it's important that the stories that we're consuming, that we're imbibing, should have the right teichen and not the wrong teichen. If they're correct, then, so as we'll get to the question of how we're defining correct or accurate is. But that's an important distinction to make right away. What do we mean when we say that accuracy is important? Mitzad what? The history or mitzad the teichen? It's important that the teichen should be correct. Like, for example, Nagunim. Nagunim aren't a story, but Nagunim can be sung correctly. They can be sung incorrectly. We know from the Previous Rebbe definitely expressed that Nagunim should be sung correctly and accurately. So is it, if you sing the niggun inaccurately, the problem is that you're committing a crime against history, that you're not singing the niggun faithfully to its historical form, or it's that the niggun, when sung accurately, has a certain ashpa, but if you start reffing and doing your own little shinuyim, so then the niggun is losing its qualities that make it a niggun. Now, if within the chassidishe world, the issue, the ikr, is more that the story should be teichendik. The story, when we say that a story is a good story, a chashuv story, we mean that it's holy, it has a holy effect. It's the message of the story is correct, is accurate, right? Every story has a message. If you make up a story or you change the story, so you're ruining the message. You can't preserve the message of the story accurately if you change the story. So if the ikr, if our definition of accuracy of a story is not necessarily how the story happened, but rather the message of the story, so then that would fit much more with what you hear in the chassidishe welt, particularly by the Polish chassidim. Often they would talk about that sipur tzadikim, it's mayses merkava, or whatever the lashonos are, the importance of sipurim. When they say that sipurim are important, kodesh kadasha, what are they referring to? They're referring to the fact that the hashpa of a chassidishe mayse has an unbelievable hashpa. So if we're looking for accuracy, and accuracy within the chassidic definition. So if the story is accurate, so then it has the accurate spiritual message, the accurate spiritual hashpah, so then it's gevaldik. And if you get that part wrong, so that's not good. Now, how are you going to make sure if you get that part right or wrong? Presumably, if you have the value, if you treasure the importance of accuracy, so if the story in its original form was good and correct and has the right hashpah, so if you have the value of conveying things accurately, so then you will preserve the tzura of the story, but the teichen, the teichen will be mechoven, will be medoyek. Masha'en kein, if you don't have that value, memela, you're not saying the story correctly, memela, the teichen is also off, so then memela, the story automatically stops being holy, special chassidishe mayse, and it starts turning more into sichas chulin, devarim b'telem. So this is all to explain why the two things are cited here adjacent to each other. Right? So if you're just sitting around and saying stamas, right? If you start mamish, you're just talking about 20 years ago in yeshiva I said this and he said that. It's for sure devarim b'telem. Chassidishe mayses, depending on what they're about, can sometimes straddle that line. If you get it right, then there's a chassidishe message there. So then it's chassidishe mayse, it's a grace azach. If you get it wrong or whatever, then it can go into devarim b'telem territory. Now, chassidishe devarim b'telem could also have a certain mila to it. There could also be some value that's conveyed and transmitted there. So it seems like there's even dargis in that, and that seems to be where this letter of the Previous Rebbe maybe is sort of focusing. But just to clarify that we're using these terms somewhat overlapping, stories, sichas chulin, devarim b'telem. And by the way, we find, certainly, I don't know if there's any more clearly like this in Chabad, but certainly we find outside of Chabad that sometimes other tzaddikim would tell stories. And sometimes they're madgish, that every time the tzaddik told the story, he told it differently. Or b'chalal, the tzaddikim told a story that sounded very fantastical. There was a king in Turkey, mayses like that are said b'shem tzaddikim. So it could be that in that context, it was perhaps understood, was implicit, that when the tzaddik was telling a story, so I believe whatever the tzaddik is saying has teichen, it's meduyik, it's accurate, but lav dafka that it was intended to be historically accurate. It could be that the teichen, whatever the teichen is accurate. The teichen is mechovim. So here you can see perhaps an example of where these two values diverge, where the historical accuracy may not be important, may not have been the point, but Hayos the tzaddik tells the story, so the tzaddik has a very specific kavana, and they're not stam dreying and hacking. They're saying something that's very oisgehalten. So that's also an important point to keep in mind here. Of how these concepts link and overlap, but are not synonymous and identical with each other. Another factor that should be mentioned here is that there's also the larger issue, in addition to the question of the story, there's the larger issue ramifications for the person himself. A person tells stories that are exaggerated, that raises questions about the person's character specifically. That's why people take offense when they're told, you say, oh, this person exaggerates. You're clearly implying something about their character. And that is also a relevant point, not so much here in this letter, but as we'll see later, the Previous Rebbe talks about it elsewhere, that hagzama itself can often be seen as a very negative trait. So this is sort of unpacking these lines about sichas chulin, dvarim b'telem. Also interesting to note that in the process of saying that it's fine, it uses a very strong lashon. So we're referring to with a lashon of iser, which seems to be referring to the fact that it's borderline devarim b'telem. So it's implying that the devarim b'telem are aser, but these devarim b'telem, they're mutter or even good. And we'll see later that the line of Vasman Meg, Vasman Tarna, Tarminet, will be invoked later in this letter, in this context, which also is more of a line that relates to Isurim, things you shouldn't do at all. In this context, talking about Sichas Chulin, Devarim B'Telem, good or bad, it's worth pointing out that this is really a letter of the Alter Rebbe about this in Tanya, Geras HaKodesh Simcha of Gimel. Talks about the whole premise of the letter is, Alter Rebbe says, Ra be'enai ha-mayses shenasa tachas ha-shamash b'chlal u'befrat, that people come to daven, and then acharat tefillah, oy lefaneha, after davening or before, nasa moshav leitzim rachman al-islan, severta moshav leitzim, and if it's a moshav leitzim in a show with a minyan where the shechina is, so that's ein locha el boina ve'kalonu de shechinta god mizet mamesh bizuy ha-shechina. Not any of it is doiche gragli ashchina, but now it's barabim, so you're being doiche kol shir koimish al yetzer breishis, very sharp for the shyness, and he quotes lines from Zohar or Zohar-like language of vai leman de dachken l'shchinta, and tlas milen mis akvi yisrael begolusa, 3 things keep yitten in galus, the dachken l'shchinta, the avden kalona b'shchinta, and doing this, Meshav Leitzim, is the definition of kalona b'shchinta. Interestingly, I actually just was looking into this Geras HaKodesh, both Simcha of Gimel and Simcha of Dal this week, because they published a tziyun of the Rebbe, and the Rebbe's one of the Rebbe's copies of Tanya. The Rebbe was mitzayin at the lashon kalona the shchinta. The Rebbe was mitzayin to a Zohar and to a Mikdash Melech, and I actually I found it interesting. I wrote something up about it a few days ago. I'm not going to get too deep off into that. But it's interesting that essentially this is another mucker where the Alter Rebbe seems to be addressing the idea of chassidim sitting around and talking and schmoozing, and here it sounds very, very negative. What were the chassidim back then talking about? Was it also not sichas chulin of chassidim and chassidish devarim? What could they have been talking about already? So interestingly, this seems a lot more negative. I should point out that this letter is dated to a particularly early point in the Alter Rebbe's life, mamish Tofkuf Mems, where we don't even know that much come out about what the Alter Rebbe was up to in the Chassidim. So it would be interesting, I guess you could throw out the line, the theory as to whether with time the Alter Rebbe came to accept the place of Chassidish Devarim B'Telem. Who knows? But it's just worth mentioning the date. But seemingly there's a case to be made that this Igeres is kind of against Chassidish Devarim B'Telem. And of course, like I alluded to, there was always this criticism from the beginning of Chassidus and throughout the Daidas that, Chassidim, they sit and they talk and they say stories, That is a known criticism. So it's interesting to keep all of this in mind. And Aliyah Mazeh, in Chabad, in the Chabad lingo, there actually is this term, Chassidish Devarim B'Telem, which is often sitting around and just talking about the history in 770, what happened in 770, 10 years ago, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, talking about this Bach and that Bach. You're not talking about grobe Sachen, goyische Sachen, gas Sachen. It's talking about stuff within the Chassidische world, but not directly, overtly teichen, not a verbringen, you're not being ma'oder to Avodas Hashem. So that term is still around. So it's interesting that the Previous Rebbe here, even though our focus here is on the question of accuracy in stories, but in the Previous Rebbe's presentation, it seems to overlap with the question of Chassidish Sichas Chulin, Chassidish Devarim B'Telem. Although, as it says here, it's Chassidish Devarim B'Telem was in the Sipurei mayses v'zaynim b'hagzama. So, like I said, connecting, interlocking, overlapping. But when the question of Chassidish Devarim B'Telem comes up, this is a relevant source as well. So okay, there's a lot to discuss, a lot to unpack here. Could go even longer, go even further, but that's probably enough at this point. I'll point out that I saw there was a kuntras that came out at Shura, that came out a bunch of years ago, not that many, like less than 10 years ago, on Rabbi Jamin Klatzker. And in the intro there, the person who worked on it seems like was a bacher, was Metzayin Tak. I was looking to see, does anyone quote this line of the Previous Rebbe about the Sepuri Chassidim that aren't Meduyek, which I remember from 20 years ago. So I wanted to see if it's not quoted that often, interestingly. It's more prominent in my mind and my memory than apparently it's not such a well-known paragraph and passage. But in that kuntras about Rabbi Yom ben Klatzker, the person who was Eirechit did go into this question over a few pages, in the question of writing chassidic history, of what importance to attach to stories that just come from different chassidic b'kairos, not from the Rebbeim. And so he quoted this letter, he quoted letters from the Rebbe. And if you look through the Rebbe over the years, the Rebbe had very interesting, like I mentioned before, the Rebbe had a certain skeptical streak, and certain times the Rebbe would say a certain story. That story is not true, b'chlal, which is very interesting. Or the story has to be, you have to change it, you have to say that it's not like Lish Azoi, it was Azoi. That itself is a fascinating topic. It's there have been shiurim given on it, and different likutim on it. And I think in that Hakdama, in that shura, he quotes an interesting line from the Rebbe somewhere. The Rebbe said, okay, this story, you know what, even if the story is not necessarily true, but at least it tells you what chassidim we're talking about, that itself has value. So the Rebbe mentions that over there. So these are all, like I said, overlapping questions. Chassidishe mayses, chassidishe devarim b'telim, the chassidishe devarim b'telim shebe chassidishe mayses. So that's all implicit here, explicit and implicit here. So that's what the Rebbe says. The Rebbe Shab said on that in the Kiddush of Shuas Tafresh Nun Beis with those guests. That was something that the Rebbe Shab said. The Rebbe continues and says that among the Archim, this chassid, these different chashiv chassidim. And I heard many stories over that Shavuos, back to the Previous Rebbe and his listening to stories, recording stories. He says already by that point, I also had an oizen bechenes. I could distinguish between stories, this story and this misaper and that misaper. But since the Shmua spread about the Rebbe Rashab said, B'Shem Deb Marash, about the importance of Sipuri mayses, so then everyone started telling mayses, like in a unique way, in a special way, and a whole new world opened for me. And I was full of, I had my work cut out for me to write everything down, because I wanted to write everything down. And chachmasi omdali, I was able to keep up, and I wrote everything b'shem oimrei. But now, so within this presentation, again, the presentation seems to be positive. That even the stories that are not true. And that's what the chassidim took from it, and they were telling stories, the Rebbe was writing it. But, as we said, the framing, the context of this letter is actually kind of to the contrary. And now the Previous Rebbe continues, that's why it's important to see the full context. The Previous Rebbe continues and says that the next year, Tov Nun Gimel, the end of Menachem Av, the Rebbe Rashab traveled to Vitebsk, and he took me with him, and he stayed in the house of his sister, Leah, and he was there for 2 weeks, a bit more. And almost every day, chassidim from Vitebsk, presumably, or those passing through, came over to visit, and they were sitting and schmoozing and telling stories. At this point, I was very good at writing, and I had a lead, a pencil, or pen, as opposed to, I guess, the more old-fashioned dipping a feather in ink. So I was writing very quickly, and I was listening to everything and writing it down right away. So one day I was sitting and eating in the dining room, and I was copying, apparently, so the video would first write the story down quickly on maybe a piece of paper, and then I was copying them into my notebook, and then Rabbi Shab walked in. He sees I'm writing. He says, what am I writing? So I showed him. So he picked up a paper, and it was stories. And the Rabbi Shab says, it's like a nice story, but this story is Yoitze Meklal Hagzama, Leklal Hachzava. It's not just guzma, it's kozov, it's pashat falsh, pashat sheker, this story that you're writing. And he continued telling me that were you to tell this story, by telling a story like this, you're taking something falsh, and you're making it look like emes. But tizar mizeh, you have to watch out for that. The Rebbe Rashab said it's good that you're writing the Zman and the Mokim, that you heard the story and the name of the Mesaper. It's important to have that information as well. But it's still not enough. The Toiv Yoiser, that you should drop it entirely. And only stories that you hear from those that you can rely upon, those you should record Lizikaran. Meaning you were overdoing it, you're writing to, even though you're being clear about the sources, but you can't just write down any story. So that itself is fascinating because the Previous Rebbe, like I said, of course, the Previous Rebbe throughout his whole life is writing stories, transcribing, recording, whether b'shas mayses or from memory. So it's interesting that the Rebbe Rashab almost confronted the Previous Rebbe at this point about the question of the stories and which stories and the accuracy. So this was a bit of a shock for the Previous Rebbe. The Previous Rebbe says what my father said. It reached my heart in the sense of a negative sense. Genommen zum Herzen, took it to heart. Because I already had a few notebooks, bound notebooks with Sipurim mayses and many, many other pages, dozens of pages that were written. But you see, chas al mayse yadai, I should felt bad for all my effort, all my work, and now he's sort of dismissing it, rejecting it. So I was so upset that I decided to speak up, even though Previous says I was usually very careful not to speak up, not to answer the Rebbe Rashab, b'pnei hakavod. And even if I said something, I would be very careful to think it over once, twice, whether it's kedai to say it and how to say it. But in this situation, it was more like I took it so much to heart that I couldn't apply my usual judicious approach. I couldn't hold myself in. So I said, Tata, or whatever the Lashon was, I told the Rebbe Rashab, last year Shavuos, Tafresh Nun Beis, you said b'shem the Rebbe Marash that the Sipuri Chassidim gam b'hagzama dover gadlu u'devarim b'telim elu shara l'an rachmana. Again, he repeats it b'kitzer that even if it's b'hagzama, it's good, it's a big thing, a great zach, and these devarim b'telim are mutter shara l'an rachmana. So I answered him back. The Previous Rebbe says. So the Rebbe Rashab looked at me with a smile or a laugh, b'haschoik hanoim asher hayaloi, and he told me, Das, was mit tarnit, tarmendach nit. Und das, was mit mag, is nit als bedarf man. So this is a famous piskam. It's not from a Yom Yom. I don't think in a Yom Yom it's quoted from here. It's quoted from elsewhere. So usually it's used to refer to Dvarim Asurim, Dvarim Mutarim. So, if it's also you're not to do it. And even Dvarim Mutarim, Taivis, whatever, mayses, darf man it. That's usually how it's understood. So it's very interesting how that he's saying that the Rebbe Rashab used it in this context. Which I said fits because the Rebbe Rashab originally, the Rebbe repeated this line of Dvarim B'Telim Elu Sharalan Achmana, that the Torah was matir these Dvarim B'Telim. So seemingly riffing on that line, the Rebbe saying, the Rebbe Rashab said that was matarnit tarminit, was memeg nit bedarfman. So just because the Dvarim B'Telim may be mutter doesn't mean that there's an inyan to speak it if it's begeder Dvarim B'Telim. And here's where the Previous Rebbe Taka concludes, and he says that back to how we started, the story that was sent to me from the Marechas Avatamim is one of those stories that goes miklal hagzama leklal hachzava, that line that he said, the B'Shem Rebbe Rashab, that it's not just exaggerated, but it's false. But having read it 2-3 times, it occurred to me that maybe what was sent to me is really a combination of 3 different stories that I do know in their correct form. And by combining them all together, now we have this exaggerated story sent to me. So in the next days, when I have time, I'll write the 3 stories that I was reminded of when I read that story. That's how the letter ends. I mean, then in Chelek Tezvav, there's maybe another line or 2 at the end, back to just personal matters, and then the Previous Rebbe signed. But that's where this part of the letter in Chelek Gimel ends. And I'm not currently aware that we have any additional information as to what the story was or what the 3 stories were. Although maybe if we keep flipping through the Chelek Gimel, maybe we would find something. It didn't seem like there was something further on this matter. So I don't know what the story was. I don't know what happened with it in the end. But that's this letter of the Previous Rebbe to the Rebbe about the importance of accuracy in stories. Like I said, the Rebbe. So anything that the Previous Rebbe wrote, the Rebbe didn't really apply any critique, skepticism, although maybe there's 1 or 2, 3 exceptions. It's its own sugya, its own parsha, the yachas to the Previous Rebbe and stiris and stuff like that. But overall, certainly 90-something% of the time, the Rebbe took it as fact, without question. But anything that was not in that category, we find a lot of skepticism. Like I said, we find a lot of skepticism by the Rebbe. So it's interesting to think about that, to consider that in the context of the Frierdiker Rebbe reaching out to the Rebbe and writing to the Rebbe at length on this point. Now, what does this mean practically? Right. So there's clearly some kind of distinction being made here, but what's the distinction? It's a little hard to pin down. It's not explicit. But one way of, I guess, formulating it would be that, let's say, like I said, when it comes to stories of the Alter Rebbe, previous Doidos, so you have, let's say, the stories that the Greinem, the Mashpia, told, and his Talmidim wrote it down. So first of all, there's a question of different Talmidim themselves have different levels of accuracy of what they remember of how he said it, because mostly they didn't write it down in B'Shas Maaseh, although recently in Genzaya, it seems they printed some stories that were written down B'Shas Maaseh, which is interesting. So let's say Reb Greinem. Is everything Reb Greinem ever said, is it true? I'm dafka. Maybe there was hagzamas, maybe there were exaggerations in things Reb Greinem said, or at least lack of accuracy. Although Grade, I think in the Hashmatas to the Rebbe's Rishimis, or the Frierdiker Rebbe's conversations with him, I think Grade is Hashmata, where the Frierdiker Rebbe says B'Shem the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Rashab held that the Greinem is a magzim. But it's a Hashmata, so I don't know if we can discuss it on the record. So let's say Reb Greinem Taka is not 100% accurate, and it could be this hagzamas. But presumably, when Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rashab, the Marash are saying that even the inaccurate is good, surely even his inaccurate stories of Reb Greinem all had a certain teichen. He was a teichendik mensch. People he was makabel from were teichendik mention. They didn't say over narishkeiten. They're saying something that has a kernel. First of all, from a historical perspective, probably has a kernel of truth, and as teichen, they weren't saying narishkeit. And at the very least, like the Rebbe said once, it tells you what the chassidim were talking about. But let's you look in the stories of Perlov, one of the Talmidim of Reb Greinem. So he brings a lot from Reb Greinem, but sometimes he brings stories where he says, there was someone in Lubavitch who would sit in the achsanya, and if you paid him a nickel or a dollar, whatever the equivalent was, you paid him a ruble, so he'd tell you a story. He's a professional storyteller. And he writes a few stories that you heard from Azalcha mention. And I think those stories tend to be a bit more fantastical. So is that on the same level? Is that on the same tier as the stories from Greinem? I don't think so. So, if the Rebbe Rashab, B'chayav, is talking about certain stories that people in Lubavitch are telling, if the Rebbe is writing it down, the Rebbe Rashab is saying, you shouldn't be writing that down, that's nishkadai. I would imagine that the guy sitting in the Achsanya telling stories is probably closer to that category. So, that would be the kind of distinction you could have had at that time, that the Rebbe Rashab is saying in some cases there is an erech, and the Frierdiker Rebbe describes the orchem, that shvuas, or chashav orchem. So whatever they were saying, they're very teichendik mention. So whatever they're saying surely was teichendik to some extent, even if it's not meduyek, and even their sichas chulun, and even their devarim b'teilim, kaviyachol, it's all teichendik. Mashenkein, then there's actual devarim b'teilim, and nisht yada, not all the devarim b'teilim was memeg darf minute. And that's talking bismanam. Now let's return now to the stories from the last 100 years, people that told stories 5 years ago, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Alachas kama v'kama, that we also earlier we had a lashon about the Zekanim Bali Tzura, the lashon the Frierdiker Rebbe at the beginning. If you hear it, the third level, Bali Tzura, so that's a dark, the Dalad was darker below that Stam mayses was mitzelt. That they don't have a source, but based on the rest of the discussion, the rest of the context, kommt aus that there has to be epis. You saw that the story is teichendik. The mentions are teichendik a mensch, or it's nikka. The story has teichen, whether or not mamish happened or happened as it's told. So when it comes to stories today, al gufa, there's been, I would think it's fair to say, there's been a drop off in teichendik a mention and teichendik stories. So certainly, even though this letter was quoted in that polemic that the Frierdiker Rebbe Rashab, Rebbe Marash says, I like the Sipurei Chassidim, but actually from the full context, the full context of the letter, kommt aus that again, even in the story that the Frierdiker Rebbe was talking about, that they sent me a story. Clearly, they were talking about a story from Alte Zeiten, and yet the Frierdiker Rebbe found it below the standards. It was so corrupted that it didn't have value. So Kal v'chomer, I think, stories that are set 50 years ago, 40 years ago, it's just because Yener is telling it and Yener thinks it's an important maysa. I think it's the rate of stories that are lav dafka so teichendik is probably much higher now than it ever was before. B'chlal, it's interesting to track the types of stories that are told, even within Chabad, even within stories about the Rebbe in the last 70 years. I've noticed, I remember when I was growing up, it seemed there were many more mayses stories, whereas today the big excitement, the big energy, the emphasis is around the stories of an interpersonal nature, a person's feelings, how the Rebbe addressed the person's feelings, and stuff like that. That's like the big emphasis now. And nish das is nicht inyoni avodas Hashem. So tzarech ian to me a lot of these mayses. Of course, there is makayros from the Rebbe about telling over a mayfis v'chulu, and that's its own discussion. I'm not going to get into the whole topic of the value of telling over stories like that. But even the Rebbe, I pointed out, the Rebbe, even on occasions where the Rebbe said, I'm going to say over a pella of the Frierdiker Rebbe, but the pella was, there's a verbringen in the Chavs or the Lamed, the Rebbe said, here's a pella of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The pella was that there was a certain political matter, or a matter that came before the court relating to the local politics, and it didn't seem like there was any chance that it would be taken care of, and yet, surprisingly, the courts accepted it, and they ruled differently. So the mayfes was, first it was a mayses shahai that just happened, and it was something that we're attributing it to the koyach of the Frierdiker Rebbe, but we don't see from the Rebbe himself that he told mamish stam mayses of people being healed and all that. So that's really its own discussion as to what stories we should be telling, or we should be seeking to tell and be seeking to hear and to internalize. The ikr in stories about avodas Hashem, and surely if you look at the Frierdiker Rebbe's mayses, the tone, the emphasis is all about avodas Hashem, and even the stories that dig into the history or dig into the personal life of someone, it always comes back around to the message in avodas Hashem. So that, by definition, is the teichen of chassidish maysa. And sometimes you can have a more liberal definition of that, and there's this sichas chulin for the category, but it all has to revolve to some extent around that. Then at some point, once it veers beyond that, then it's sichas chulin mamish and dvarim b'telim mamish, and or dvarim b'telim that was memeg but medarnit. So it's interesting to see that in the larger context of the Frierdiker Rebbe's entire letter here. B'hemshich to that, I thought to look quickly through the Frierdiker Rebbe's writings to see where else he talks about hagzama. And I only searched for the word hagzama. It could be there are other passages or other forms of the word or other terms. I just, to keep it limited to some extent, I searched for hagzama. So in many places, the Frierdiker Rebbe uses hagzama actually as a critique to people who cannot evaluate themselves accurately. Either they overstate their greatness to themselves, or they overstate how terrible they are. So you have, I'm not going to go through all of them, I have them in front of me, but I'm not going to quote them one by one, but you have letters where this person likes the hafla, he likes the hagzama, and that's synonymous with sheker, with chitzoni. This guy's a chitzon, he thinks he's all that, he's not so great. Different letters to that effect of a person in avodas Hashem has to approach himself, evaluate himself, b'lishum hagzama, la'echad min hatzadim of toivera. Multiple letters to this effect. You can't be b'hagzama b'mayles atzma, you can't be b'hagzama b'chasernes atzma, both are kozov, v'sheker. The devarim somewhere, ala vesen v'mos, this is that inyan from hagzama, everyone knows how disgusting it is, how repulsive it is, hagzama, exaggerating. So this is the general, when hagzama is invoked by the Frierdiker Rebbe, it's pretty negative, it's a pretty negative thing. It's in a mimer in Tafresh Peches. It talks about midas toivis, midas rois. An example of midas rois that he gives is that a person knows he has a problem, but he can't control himself. Ledaber divrei hagzama v'sheker. And even though he's suffering from it, light from them, but he can't bepile himself stam through seichel, but he rather requires avodah to stop. So that's an example of a person is a compulsive exaggerator. That's a midorah. Another place where the Frierdiker Rebbe mentions it is in Tafresh Petes, talking about the Rav, how people have this very nasty streak, very nasty trait. Its own interesting discussion. It goes all the way back to Mittel Rebbe, this very detailed depiction of people that have this Schlechtskeit. So one of the expressions of the Schlechtskeit is that he says there's a Schlechtskeit that's even more edel, where he hears something that someone else did that's no good, but he like harps on it and dwells on it and expands it. And in that case, it's not a dvar sheker or a hagzama, but it's marchiv zebim oid, and he's explaining how bad and terrible what that person did was. And that's also interesting. I thought to mention it. But in particular, in Tafresh Tzadik Tes, there was an interesting, lengthy passage about hagzama. It's talking about you have to be mevair, biur, hara, get rid of the ra, and you have to be b'kabbalas oil, and you have to seek after, search the ra, and be doichel ra, and it's all b'kabbalas oil, like an eved who's cleaning the yard. You have to search of midara, the Yetzer Hara every day is looking to get you. And the example the Rebbe gives right away, we see b'mochesh b'teva b'nei adam shehisiraglu b'hagzama, they got used to exaggerating. And it wasn't their kavanah to be meshaker. They're not lawyers, but yadizach, they expand it, magdilim, marchivim, barichos, and this hergel, this habit becomes a nature, becomes a teva, and over time they become dovrei shkarim. So either they become liars, or they turn into someone who sits around sitting to telling devarim b'teilim. So alaroiv b'meshach hazman, if you're going down that track, the Yetzer Hara is out to get you. So then you turn into bali rechilos, bali lashon hara, mitzia shemra, or they turn into leitzim and they miskabdim b'kloinam shel chavreim. They glorify themselves in their fellows' shame. And kasher soif kol soif, when they're nisoira to rectify their ways. Even if they're trying to be careful, but they're so habituated, they're so used to it, so they're nichshol multiple times, almost without realizing. Filled garnit as zok ligin or v'hadaima. And then afterwards, when he chaps, oh yeah, I said sheker, rechil lashon hara, he feels takabad lefi erkai, but it's the lack of the kabbalas oil. He didn't address it and fix it properly. But that's the tzir the Previous Rebbe gives of being mevayer the ra, and you need the chipos, and you need the kabbalas oil, you need the dchia, the Yetzer Hara. That's the example the Previous Rebbe gives, very interesting. And a lot of what the Previous Rebbe is describing seems to overlap with what we discussed earlier, the idea of, well, the way he expresses the issue. Either it turns into sheker, or it turns into devarim b'teilim. And that sort of corresponds to the discussion about stories in general. I mean, here it's about the person's personality and traits. But back to the question of the stories themselves, there's the issue of the story is sheker, or there's the issue of if the story is devarim b'teilim, and it seems like sometimes there is a mile of devarim b'teilim, but you have to know where to draw the line, and sometimes it's stam devarim b'teilim. Again, here the Previous Rebbe is not talking about the chassidishe mayses, but it's still an important parallel passage in my opinion. Also, interestingly, in Tafshin Yud Aleph, one of the kuntresim that was printed in Tafshin Yud Aleph of the Previous Rebbe, so there's a reshima there, Tafresh Nun Beis, from the Previous Rebbe's childhood, and brings a story there. I looked at it very quickly. It wasn't clear to me if it said clearly who told the story, whether it was one of his malamdim, but there's like a whole story there. That was mayses, there was a yeled, Balkishrin, who started exaggerating and slowly became a big shakrin, and his father and his mother and his brother or brothers stayed away from him. No one wanted to talk to him. The boy got older, became a nar, and no one wanted to talk to him, and he himself understood that it's a bush to be a shakrin. He wanted to do tshuva, he couldn't. Years went by, he learned a lot of Torah, but he couldn't heal himself from the shaker. And every dibur, even in Torah, there was a dvar hagzama or a shaker. And even if people chapped and said, hey, that's a shaker, he didn't stop, it didn't bother him, or whatever the exact connotation there is, but he wanted to leave his path, but he couldn't. But he heard that in a certain city there's a Talmud Chacham, a tzaddik, and he went to get a refuah and a tshuva of how to be healed from the sheker. That's the beginning of the story. The story that they told him not to say a sheker, not to talk for 5 years, and then he accidentally spoke, so then he became mute for 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, he was healed, something like that. So that story needs to be analyzed more and evaluated. What's going on with that story? Why is it there? And who told it? It's interesting that the Previous Rebbe told Azam and Maisa, which is like, it's not a Maisa Shahaya per se, it's like a Maisa Musari, it's like a Musar Dika Maisa, like a Chavis Halavavis Dika Maisa or something like that. But at any rate, it seems like there's a link between the question of accuracy in chassidishe mayses and the question of the personality trait of hagzama being a magzim. These are both topics the Previous Rebbe discussed and addressed. And yet, even though there's all this negativity in all the other writings of the Previous Rebbe about hagzama, but yet in that letter it's stated that sometimes hagzama is fine, or it's not the end of the world. So I would point out that we're talking about hagzama. We have to distinguish between unconscious hagzama, particularly if it happens slowly and gradually, from Gilgal to Gilgal, the story keeps on getting repeated, and every time it gets repeated, the person is kainet b'shinoi, or a person's memory, if they happened to them 20 years ago, or they heard it 20 years ago, person's memory can just alter things automatically. It doesn't mean that there's something particularly wrong with them. Adrabah, that's sort of normal. And Adrabah, someone who can avoid, if all their memories are 100% accurate, that's usually considered a grace and maila. Wow, this person's a Baal Diuk, a Baal Shmua. Most people are not on that diagram. Most people, normal, things gradually shift and evolve. And then there's real hagzama. When you say, oh, this person is magzim, a person says guzmas, so that's usually chasaran. That's below the mean, below the average. So that distinction could be helpful in distinguishing between what the Previous Rebbe is talking about in the Rebbe Rashab, Rebbe Marash, in a positive sense, versus all these other quotes about the tremendous negativity of hagzama. So it all depends on the context and the matter. Now, it could be there were stories that Chassidim told 100 years ago that by the time they were telling it were so exaggerated that it's almost ridiculous. But you could say, look, chashiva people told it over, and maybe even if it happened, but it happened slowly and organically, and it still tells you something, like the Rebbe said, it tells you something about the siach, the whole, what they were talking about. Could be that in certain contexts we have a more tolerant view of hagzama. But it certainly seems like, generally speaking, we do not have tolerance of hagzama, and it's considered a very negative thing. And the overall takeaway from the Previous Rebbe seems to be that it is negative and it should be avoided. And it Simon Tzad Shaka, Simon Tzad Devarim B'Telem. So the way I would take it is that stamazoi a mayse, if it doesn't have a good makar or it doesn't seem to have much teichen, yodei tachtoina. That's my opinion. That's my takeaway. It has to pass a certain bar. It has to meet certain standards for us to say that alpha pikein, it has teichen, it has value. So, like I said, this overlaps with just being a hiker and just enjoying the process of researching and being medayek and getting the details. These are not necessarily always the exact same thing, but it seems like the hiker and the chassid who wants to avoid the guzmas and devarim b'telem have a lot in common. And I guess chassidishe hiker is doing that, hopefully for the right reasons. Of course, the question is, how much time should a person be spending debunking? So, at this point, the corpus of chassidishe mayses that are from 100 years ago and more is pretty much static at this point. We're not going to get many more new stories. And then we approach those stories as all having some degree of teichen. Often the same story has 5, 6, 7, 10 different girsayos anyway. Then there's still room for a chayker to come along and say, hey, if you're also interested in the historicity, let's be mevara which girsa is the most accurate, etc. So you can, in dem gufa, you could have the most accurate, and then you can have less accurate, but still more or less it has a kernel of truth. It's not terrible. It's not awful. So these are ways in which being chayker and chassidishe mayses can overlap. But then once you get into the last 100 years or so, in my opinion, the chances that there's value I think drops off. And then the question is, so should you be spending your time being oisik in it and debunking it? If you think that it's nish teichendik, so then it's probably nish kedai to spend the time debunking it either. Obviously, the Rebbe Rashab only took a few moments and he looked at it and he said, okay, this is not it. Obviously, the Previous Rebbe himself spent a lot of time being oisik in stories, and including most of the time writing stories, but also sometimes rejecting or reacting to other stories and saying they're not true, or worse. The Rebbe also spent time in the process of, because since the Previous Rebbe and the Rebbe, we have a musik of Chabad historiography, and we have official works of history. So it's important. Someone has to take the time to get the facts right, and so you have people that's their mumchias, and like I said, the Rebbe was mekarev these types and gave them these types of jobs. And today it comes to the Rebbe's biography. Who's going to write the Rebbe's biography? So anyone can write anything. Then you have those that are trying to be medayik. You have the book, the early years, and they're very upfront about the standards of truth and accuracy that they require. It has to be, I haven't checked recently, but it has to be miklirishin, it can't be miklishen. What do they have there? It has to be primary sources, so even stories that are mefursim to be true, but if it's shown ish b'piyish, I think they don't include it. So these are questions that, especially those who are oisik in publishing, which the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe in particular were oisik in publishing chassidishe mayses. So these are questions that have to occupy them, and it is someone's job. Someone has to sit there and decide whether a certain story is true. It's roy litfos, roy lepirsum, not roy litfos, not roy lepirsum. Especially when it's not just telling a story person to person or sitting around and speaking to Rambam, but it's being put b'tfus, as the Rebbe used to say, davish b'tfus is l'doiris. So that has to be taken very seriously. So there certainly is room for those who need to take the time, even spend hours, days, weeks, months, years being oisik in this tchum, because it has these kinds of ramifications. So there is room, it seems, for chokrim who even want to make it a full-time or a large part-time occupation. There is room for seeing the importance in that. But ultimately, like I said, part of the question is the historical accuracy, but part of it is also the teichen. And sometimes there could be a story where, it doesn't seem like it's fully historically accurate, or it's hard to understand how it could have happened, but if Chashiv Chassidim said it, or at least the Malga Chassidim 100 years ago was a bewusste mayse, so l'chayr it has some teichen to it. Even then, we find that the Rebbe sometimes rejected stories, which is interesting, even though they were meforsim. So these are all the issues, or many of the issues that are involved here, and hopefully this shed some light and provided some perspective on this matter. Of course, there are other letters from this date, but this was, I think, more than enough. So I think we'll suffice with that. If anyone has any salient and lesser known mekayres from the Rebbeim about accuracy and this whole topic on sugya, of course, I'm happy to hear. And but like I said, this is a big topic. It's been a notable topic for me for at least 20 years. And it's sort of, you can't escape it. We're constantly, to whatever degree, bombarded, surrounded by stories. And this is something we have to discuss and think about. And this is my contribution to the topic.